The life of Paul is truly an intriguing one, a marvelous story. I mean, he's an amazing man, and we find the power of God interweaved and interleaved into his narrative. While Sue and I were doing a marriage workshop with 7 couples up in Alabama, it was wonderful to speak to people about things far deeper than what they've normally would have experienced, or rather been spoken to in the past. And in fact, there were 2 people from the university that was there, and both of them are very heavily studied and thoroughly enjoyed it, and we discussed it subsequent, and there'd possibly be a follow-up next year. But for now, I want to speak about Paul and his life. Paul, obviously, as you know, wrote the letters of 2 Corinthians. The first time he wrote the letter was telling him that he couldn't make it, he couldn't be with them. And what was sad is that his motive were immediately questioned. Secondly, also wrote them to encourage them to be a forgiving people and not allow Satan to trap them. He also wrote them, the third reason was he spoke to them and said, guys, there is a famine in Jerusalem. Please help those who are struggling. And finally, he also wrote about something very close to his heart, and that's to speak about his authority as an apostle. We know that there were a group of Corinthian brethren there that really were nasty and tried to complicate his life on every single level. And these people really told the Corinthian church that Paul's credentials were highly questionable, and that Paul was just one of the many that was a charlatan. And so we find that Paul in chapter 11 defends himself, and he goes on to almost say something along the lines of, if you really want to compare credentials, he says, let me tell you a little bit about myself in 2 Corinthians 11 from verse 21. He says, whatever they dare to boast about, I'm talking like a fool again. I dare to boast about it too. Are they Hebrews, and so am I? Are they servants of Christ? I know, and I sound like a madman, but I've served them far more. I've worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped 5 times, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I have traveled on many long journeys. I've faced dangers from rivers and from robbers. I've faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I've faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I've worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. And so Paul would say to them, guys, if you really want to start comparing, he says, look at my resume. And I can just imagine Paul very frustrated. But Paul turns around, and rather than trying to state the positives about his resume, he says to them, but if I must boast in 2 Corinthians 11:13, he says, I would rather boast about the things that shows how weak I am. And so that leads us into chapter 12, where Paul absolutely deals with things that are fundamentally focused on Jesus Christ. Sue and I and the children, we had to drive to New York to have Hannah registered as the South African consulate. And we arrived there, and it was 11 hours from city Townsend, which is a beautiful city in the Smoky Mountains. I wish you could see that and experience that. It's absolutely amazing. It is a beautiful city and a beautiful town that on that particular Saturday they had a car show, and there were hundreds and thousands of people that descended on that town. Every conceivable modification on a car was there at that time, and it was absolutely spectacular to see. But you couldn't move because the traffic was just so crazy. We drove around, and eventually we on our way back, we came through Huntsville, and that's the place of NASA. And it reminded me, specifically for the sermon, is that in 1969, and many of you were not born at that time yet, but Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had landed on the moon on a vehicle called Eagle near the Sea of Tranquility. The whole country, I was led to believe, in America, and I was reading a documentary about that specific moon landing, where people were glued to their seats watching this moon landing, specifically how he would have walked on the moon. And the story goes that as he climbed down the ladder, he would have said, "That's a small step for man, but one giant leap for mankind." When he got back to Earth a short while later, and it's very well documented that he had an emotional breakdown. And the story is that when they asked him about that, he said, "How is it possible, after seeing such an amazing event, at looking at Earth from such a perspective, that you are not eternally changed?" In other words, he said he was changed in such a profound way. He said it changed him in such a profound way that even the mundane things of paying bills, receiving a salary, working in the garden just seemed to be so mundane compared to what he had done. I would imagine his wife would have said to him, "Well, Neil, that is wonderful, but I think you need to come down from your pedestal and clean the garage." So when one looks at all these wonderful things, one could almost see the Apostle Paul in the same situation. You see, what Neil Armstrong saw was going into the second heaven. The first heaven is where we see where the birds and the clouds and the rain is made in the heavens. But we know the second heaven is with the planets and with the stars. But we also know that Paul would have gone to the third heaven, and that's where God is. We hear from the account that Paul wrote is that for 14 years he kept this secret to himself. And I would imagine that it's completely counterintuitive that probably after experiencing something so amazing as landing up in the third heaven where God is, that he probably would have come back to want to tell everybody about that and say, "Hey, my claim to fame is that I was in the third heaven and I saw God." You see, when people were asking about his credentials, Paul says, "My credentials is not as to who I am or who you perceive that I am. My credentials is in the lives of the people that I work and that I serve." You see, Paul would say to them, "This boasting is not good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell you about visions and revelations from the Lord." In other words, they would constantly try, in Afrikaans we say, to takel hom af. And Paul would say, "You are a letter that is written, and you are the evidence of what God had provided, nothing else." We know that Paul had many visions with Christ Jesus. We know on the road of Damascus, he met Jesus Christ, who asked him the question, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" We know in Acts chapter 16, Paul had another vision of a man from Macedonia saying to him, "Come over to Macedonia." We also know in Acts 18, while Paul was being persecuted in Corinth, he had a vision one night where the Lord said to him, "Don't be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent." We also know in Acts chapter 23 that Paul would hear from Jesus Christ in Acts chapter 23 verse 11 saying, "Take courage, as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." We also know in Acts chapter 27, on his way to Rome, his ship was about to be destroyed in a storm, but an angel of the Lord appeared to Paul in a vision and said, "You're going to testify before Caesar. You're going to preach the gospel to Caesar himself. You're not going to die on this trip." And so what we do know about Paul is that this idea of visions and personal visitations with the divine was not uncommon. But that was something that never inflated his ego. And Paul eventually starts in verse 2. He says, "I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. But what I do know is that I was caught up to paradise. We watch how the Bible is translated in that specific area where it is spoken of in the third person, and we can see the reluctance of Paul to place himself at the center of this narrative, but indeed he then says, I want to tell you about a man. You see, on that journey, we know Paul went through some great difficulties. You see, on that journey, Paul preached in Lystra where he was stoned. He was dragged out of the city, threw rocks at him, and they thought he was dead. Paul got right up and went back into that city. You see, Paul was no coward. No matter how difficult it is at times, Paul's example for us is paramount to say no matter how difficult it is, no matter how counterintuitive it is to want to go back and stay faithful to God, that is what God requires. And Paul in his vision says, I don't know whether I was alive or dead. I can't be sure. But this I can tell you, I was caught up into the third heaven. You see, I spoke about the third heaven already. In fact, the first heaven is the atmosphere above us. The second heaven is the celestial heaven and the outer space. The sun, the moon, and the stars. And the third heaven is where God is. All the other areas you and I can go to with human mechanisms. But the only place you can go to into the third heaven is with God. It's assistance. You see, Khrushchev said in a speech, when the Russian cosmonaut traveled into space and he got back, he said, why are you clinging to God? He said to Yuri Gagarin, you didn't even see God. Well, of course he didn't. But he went far enough to understand that what he saw was so profound. And if you and I are not amazed at things, at the heavenlies, if you and I are not amazed at what God has done in our lives, we are robbing ourselves of so much. Paul kept silent for 14 years. You see, if it was today, we would probably grab a publisher, tell them our story, have it put on paper, and just say how great we are. Paul kept quiet. Let me ask you a question. How do I explain to you what an Alabama sunset is like? How do I explain to you the beauty of the Tennessee River going through so many cities and so many towns and so many states? How do I explain to you what it looks like and feels like being at Ground Zero in New York, where so many people died on 9/11? Sue and I stood there and we experienced the most profound feeling. Right in the middle of the first tower, there was a massive crater that was created out of stainless steel. And they've got this water running across into this abyss. And on the outer rim of this particular monument, you'd find in stainless steel all the names of those who died in that particular structure. And in the next one was etched into that stainless steel. And there was one solitary rose. Ruan took a picture of it. And I saw the picture and I said, I want to take some myself. And I went back to that particular moment, and I'll send it to the group just now. It's something that affected us profoundly. We stood there, Sue and I, and we were both saying, this feels strange. You had this feeling of holiness because you realized that out of that building, people were jumping out to save their lives. It's nothing else than holy when so many people have died. But how do I explain that to you without you actually being there and experiencing it? And so we find that Paul has the same challenge. How do you explain to somebody the red sunsets in the state of Alabama? How do you do that? How do you even explain it to a blind person? To explain, he'll say to you, what is red? What is orange? Those kind of things is so amazing. And so we are not surprised that Paul would have been so humble about it. But Paul says one thing, he says, the experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to go there. Because this is not about me or how wonderful I am, because God had selected me to experience that moment in the third heaven. He said, so to keep me from being proud, he said, God, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from being proud. You see, Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, and I want to speak about that a little bit to you this morning, and maybe this morning you're feeling the same. Sometimes you feel this moments of elation because you're experiencing something so wonderful, and Satan taps you on the shoulder, and he said to you, come down, boy. They'd love to humiliate, to dull the pain of wonderment when you become amazed at who God is. But sometimes God helps us to understand that we must not become proud. You see, everything is about Him. To keep me from being proud, I was given a thorn in the flesh, a message from Satan to torment me. Messenger from Satan. And he says 3 times, I beg God to take it away from me. And I want to say to you today that there are 2 different agents at work in your life. The first one is God for everything that's good, everything that's holy, everything that exposes you to the wonderment of God. And then there is Satan, who constantly behind the scenes is busy trying to, I almost want to say, to rain on your parade. I was going to use another word. And this man is ugly, is horrible, and constantly is trying to derail you from experiencing the joy of being a child of God. Satan has a goal, he has a plan, and he has a motivation. And so too has God. The one is to destroy, and the other one is to build you up. And then what happens is that within that awareness, and we spoke about it during our Bible study, is that sometimes we underestimate Satan and think that he's someone that we can toy with. He is an exceptionally bright person, and he manifests in the lives of so many people because they allow it to happen. You see, Paul wants us to understand a few things. Firstly, that even when you are elated, know this, that Satan will be sure that there's a come down. But the second part of it that Paul wants us to know is that Romans 8:28 is true. That speaks that God will work all things out for good. And I love the example that Charles had, because even in the event of his brothers wanting to kill him, relented and rather sold him into slavery, he stayed in the prison for 14 years. And then obviously Potiphar's wife never ever stopped to try to tempt this man. We find that Joseph eventually, when he had all the opportunity to pull the trigger on these brothers of his, he said, am I God? I am not God. And then he says these words, which I want you to hear, where he says, you meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. And so everything that happens in your life, maybe today you've got an illness that is really, really bad. Maybe today you've got like they thought with Paul, he's got a problem with his eyes. Maybe that he had malaria or epilepsy or some other physical ailment. One Scottish commentator mentioned that Paul's thorn in the flesh was his wife. Now, it was very interesting. The guy that counted that says that maybe this guy had marital problems, and he sort of equated the thorn in the flesh to his wife, and then he projected that onto Paul. I don't believe that anyway. The bottom line is this morning that no matter what you're going through this morning, you might be struggling and saying, Lord, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. I don't know how I'm going to overcome this. But what I do know is that you are able. You see, Paul, right in the beginning in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he said that all these things happened so that I would lean on God more. And sometimes when you are elated because things are going well, and Satan is an agent and he works down to actually to just burst your bubble, just say to yourself, man, thank you for that. Because what it does is it helps you to understand that God is in control and that God can work this out for good. When Satan had his greatest moment to crucify Jesus Christ and hang him on the cross to open humiliation, even the implication of him being hung on a cross was that he would be cursed. God worked it for good so that you and I can be saved today. And so when you look at your life and your husband's very selfish, or your wife is not as sensitive as you'd like her to be, that disease is part of your life and you're struggling, know this, that when you turn to God in your weakness during those moments of tremendous vulnerability, that God picks up the slack and you can serve Him better because God is able to. What a wonderful experience that in your moment of deepest challenge and weakness, that you can cry out to God and say, Lord, here I am your child, please help. 3 different times Paul shouted and said, Lord, please help. Take this away from me. This illness, this person, this problem just doesn't want to go away. And then what God says, not that He says, I'll take the thorn away, but He says, my grace is sufficient for you. What I want you to note is that Paul didn't just pray once or twice. He prayed 3 times about it. And every single time the answer was the same. My grace is sufficient for you. And not only that, but he also says, my power is made complete through you. And so therefore Paul finds this as a profound moment to revision his life, to rather see this as a moment where God can be glorified rather than him be elevated, to say, Lord, thank you then for Satan, whatever messenger you send, so that I can be humbled, turn to God, lean on Him. And then he says in verse 10 of chapter 12, that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecution, troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For me, that's a profound moment of aliveness that comes when you and I are going through difficulties. You see, Paul says, I would rather boast of being weak. When you and I go for an interview and people ask you a question, what do you think your strengths are? Immediately you say, well, I'm this, I'm that, I can do this well, I can do that well, I've done this and I've done that. But you will watch how Paul in his resume says, no, none of that. He says, my work speaks for itself, but what I want you to know here is not about me or how great I am, but how great God is. And I want to tell you about the moments of weaknesses in my life that I've experienced God in my life. And hence he says, man, alive, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Totally counterintuitive. It's only recently that reductive science has actually validated the fact of vulnerability. Now, last year, it's now become a psychological area of study called vulnerability. René Brunet has brought this out into the open. Jesus said this 2,000 years ago. Do you get it? We don't want to be vulnerable, but Paul says it's okay. Because the center of my life and the core foundation and source of my life is not my own strength, but in fact God's strength. So whenever I'm weak, no matter what you say, yes, it's true that I'm weak. Yes, I'm not who you say that I am. Yes, I am everything and more that you think I am. But God is the one who brings me through, and to Him be all the glory, honor. You see, when we look at Paul, we sometimes think of ourselves when we buy our children presents. We buy them 2 kinds of presents. The one is something they really want. And that might be a bicycle or something like that. And the next part of the presents is we buy them a pair of socks because that's what they need. Oh, they love the one that they can get and they glory in that. But the pair of socks, they kind of, yeah, okay. In the same way, God says to you, that those 2 parts of your life is so important, because even the bad is important because it keeps you closer to my heart. And so this morning, maybe you are struggling with a relative that's lying in hospital and struggling because you don't know what the outcome will be. Maybe last night you sat at a deathbed, and I'm speaking to Quentin and Melanie at the moment and saying that it's hard because it's difficult trying to get your head around that your mom was just here the day before and now she's gone. But today you can say that, when I'm weak and I'm strong because God is the one that sustains us. And it's not surprising that James would say, count joy when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that your faith produces steadfastness. And steadfastness has its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And so whatever is meant for bad in your life, illness, willful people hurting you, hurting your reputation, God says that's okay because I have got the ability to work that out for good. It's not surprising that David, when God placed some options before him, when he counted the fighting men, that he would say, I'd rather throw myself into the hands of God than into the hands of mankind, because God is merciful. This morning, I don't know where you are with God. I certainly know where I am. And I pray today that your walk with God will be refreshed because of what we shared from His Word. Your perspectives will be renewed because you look at your challenge and the difficulties that you're experiencing. En die moeilikheid wat jy deurgaan en wat so absoluut moeilik is, wat jy voel, Here, ek voel my wêreld is besig om in te sink. My drome is besig om voor die son te verdwyn. And God's saying to you, I am still God of heaven and earth, and I can still bring you through it. And therefore we say, when I'm weak, then I'm strong, because God's power is revealed in weakness. And so Paul would say, so therefore I'll rejoice in my weaknesses, because when I'm weak, then I am strong. If you need prayers of the congregation, or you want to turn your life to Christ this morning, I pray that you'll do so. We'd gladly spend time with you, and the little we know will help and try to encourage you. And you can have the elders pray not only for you, but with you. And pray that we all stand as we sing our song of encouragement. Let's close our service for this morning.